Hello and welcome to the West's Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
We received over 1,000 questions this week. Huge thanks to all those who took time to write in on Twitter and email. Okay, Alastair, where do you want to start this week? I think you said, just as we were finishing yesterday, that we hadn't got on to Japan, which we promised to. Should we have a little chance to talk about Shinzo Abe in Japan?
Yeah, and also we talked about Sri Lanka, and we had a few questions on that, so we should do that as well. I mean, Shinzo Abe, incredibly sad, and I mean, he was, not exactly my kind of politician. He was a right-wing nationalist. But he was an extraordinary figure, because Japan, where a little bit like, yes, there's a dominant ruling party, but they did kind of change their prime ministers quite a lot, and he had 2 terms in office, and between them became Japan's longest serving prime minister. And one of the best things about Japanese politics, they have incredibly, a little bit, I think even closer than ours, campaigning is very much out with the people. And he was out on the campaign stump. There's all these questions now about why didn't he have better security, but that's kind of how they campaign. And they have very, very, very tough gun laws. So, I think you have to have psychological checks to have a gun. You even have to, you can't have a gun if you've had a criminal record. You even have your neighbours interviewed by police.
Yeah.
And the neighbours have a right of saying, no, we don't think you should have a gun. And this guy, the guy made his own gun. I think you can see that in the pictures. But the other thing that was interesting about it is...
Let's just on that, Alistair, on that one for a second. Obviously, some incredibly distasteful American Republicans are trying to suggest this shows that gun laws don't make any difference. But that isn't true at all. In fact, actually, the gun laws have made an enormous difference. And
well, they had 3. They had in 2017. They had 3 gun-related deaths in the entirety of Japan.
And that's a very important figure. And also, assassinations in Japan incredibly rare. I mean, there was one famous attempt in assassination in the 1960s, and then a mayor was killed in the early 2000s over a personal affair. But this is not normal in Japanese politics. It's a horrifying thing. Japanese politics, very similar to British politics, actually. Real, proper parliamentary system. Quite a lot of the seats first past the post. 2 chambers, a monarchy, of course, an island state. But unlike British politics, although I think you tend to say that Conservative parties become a bit like this, but the domination of the Liberal Democratic Party, which is their right-wing party in Japanese politics, been extraordinary. I think it's called, I'm going to get the date wrong, it's something called like the 1952 system, but essentially...
I think 1955 was their first win. And of course, Abe's grandfather on his mother's side, he was a prime minister. He came from a very, very, very political party. Actually, Rory, I've got a little, as you know, I like to catch you out on your knowledge, because you do have a lot of knowledge, but I'll give you £1 million, which I don't have to give. That's how confident I am. I'll give you £1 million if you could tell me what medical connection I have with Shinzo Abe.
You both... God, this is a chance for £1 million. Is this the thing that Shinzo Abe claimed to resign for in his first term? He left.
You have 5 seconds.
He left after. You're worried you're going to lose £1 million. You're
5,
really worried
4,
I'm going to win
3,
£1 million.
2, 1. It was ulcerative colitis.
I was going to win £1 million.
You were so close. You were so close. No, he had.
Thank goodness that you got in so quickly. That's right. So,
God,
and he resigned for ulcerative colitis. Said that was the reason he was stepping down after only a year in office. I could have been. If I'd won that, I would not have been in this airport hotel. In the future, I would have been travelling luxury. And I know you always pay your debts. Otherwise, the real Rory would have been pretty cross with you if you hadn't delivered.
He would have been very cross. He would have been very cross. Yeah. But he had ulcerative colitis, which I had for a long period of time, and we were on the same medication, Asacol. And I had a kind of miraculous recovery, because my doctor told me you're going to have to live with this for the rest of your life, and eventually it risks becoming Crohn's disease, which is quite a depressing thought. And then, so I had to go for these annual checkups, and then one year it just went. And something similar happened to Abe. He actually stepped down, and then the colitis cleared up, and that's when he then went back in. It did come back with him, I think. I don't know why I'm telling my medical history in a story about a politician's assassination.
And we'll get off your near miss there, back onto Nobusuke Kishi. So it's difficult to analyze somebody else's politics, and I'm sure I'm getting something wrong because one looks at another country, but it does seem with Shinzo Abe something very old-fashioned about it. His father was the foreign minister, and he was his father's aide. His grandfather, as you pointed out, Nobusuke Kishi, was the prime minister. Nobusuke Kishi's brother was also the prime minister.
And Abe had also been the cabinet secretary, which is reckoned to be like deputy prime minister. I mean, they're quite tight.
And then if we reach back, so Nobusuke Kishi, I think the other thing to say is that he was a serious war criminal. Nobusuke Kishi, his grandfather, was the Japanese economic administrator of Manchuria in China in the lead up to the Second World War. And he ran an economic policy where he brought in Japanese industrial companies to drive up economic productivity and essentially ran slave labor camps. They had to replace tens of thousands of Chinese workers a year who simply died through starvation and overwork. And Nobusuke Kishi partied in Shanghai with prostitutes and big drinking. A very, very brilliant man. He passed out top from Tokyo University, came from a samurai family that got into sake brewing. So it's a reminder with, as I suppose is true with German politics in the immediate post-war period, how much of this still looms over Japanese politics.
Well, I tell you something which I think could be part of the fallout of Abe's assassination, because one of Abe's big things was trying to change the constitution, very resonant of the German debate, so that Japan could be a much more active military power. He was constantly trying to increase defence spending and being blocked. But actually, in part of the sort of, because it's been, you can imagine the coverage in Japan has been utterly enormous. And they had the elections he was campaigning in, they did much better than was expected, and they attribute that to his death. And likewise now, the debate about defence spending and the military posture, particularly vis-a-vis China, and also I think they're a little bit worried sometimes about their relations with India as well. So whether that actually will have a more lasting impact, I think is an interesting question.
And he, of course, created this thing called the Quad, which is, in that case, was Australia, US, India, Japan, to try to see what they could do to advance. And so I think that's, I think it could be really, really interesting. Tell us a little, Sri Lanka a little bit, because I haven't been following Sri Lanka. I know much less about it than you do.
There's a question from Angus. I live in Sri Lanka. I was at the protest at the weekend. Is there any country that's been through similar corruption, financial crisis, foreign currency run, debt default, and come through on the other side? Now, there was then somebody called Hippogriff who recommended Indonesia as a possible answer to that question. But it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, this is a crisis which is going to have really, really long-standing consequences for that. I know is the statement of the obvious, but even thinking about how they get from where they are now, the president has vanished. They think he may be on a naval vessel somewhere. Yeah. It was hard not to laugh at those pictures of all the protesters diving.
I believe he's just resigned. I believe he's now formally.
Well, they've announced he's resigning.
Right.
Whether he has or not. I mean, I think there's so little trust now that people don't believe it. And it was the speaker, unless something's happened overnight, it was the speaker of the parliament who announced that he was resigning, because the speaker is the one who is third in line. So if the president and the prime minister both go, then it's the speaker who's lined up. And is this something you would want to take on?
These Sri Lanka is a really interesting country, because in some ways it was a source of huge optimism, obviously horrifying civil war, and then a moment of real economic recovery, but has been very unlucky in some ways. I mean, hit horribly by the tsunami. Had this very bizarre experiment that we talked about, I think, on the show, where they decided to go full organic farming. And there was a moment where the president was absolutely heralded by bits of the environmental movement around the world for being...
He banned fertilizer, didn't he?
That's it. Well, because unfortunately, to create the amount of manure that would have been required to fertilize the fields would have required 7 times the number of cows that are actually in Sri Lanka. I mean, that type of real sort of, he was going for a very old-fashioned type of organic farming, obviously is just not as intensive. You just can't grow as much food.
There's another lesson in here for the Tory leadership contenders, because President Rajapaksa, one of the other things that is now being put into the scales of judgment against him were massive tax cuts in 2019, which cost them 1.4 billion, and are now seen as one of the reasons why the economy went foot.
Well, I mean, boy, is he an example of radical politics. I mean, so big bet on organic farming. I mean, maybe being a bit unfair to say they couldn't produce food with those methods, but they certainly needed a much longer transition to do it safely, and those radical tax cuts. And I think a real warning to politicians who think that being bold and radical is necessarily the way to go. Now, here we are. David Pearson, what is the strangest experience you've had at a political event or meeting? I was coordinating Xi Jinping and David Cameron's 2015 visit to a National Football Museum in Manchester. Just out of view of these VIPs, one member of the British security staff tried to gently move a Chinese counterpart to one side. The Chinese security official reacted by wrestling his British counterpart to the ground. The two men in suits continued fighting, were finally dragged out of the room by their team. So this is kind of amazing. So the British security guy goes up to the Chinese bodyguard, and the Chinese bodyguard, at which point, does some amazing martial arts move. While Xi Jinping and David Cameron are walking around the National Football Museum. Go on, what's your strangest experience at a football event, a political event or meeting?
Oh, God, I've done hundreds of them. The one that popped into my mind when you were telling that story was I remember on a trip once with Trevor, who was Margaret Thatcher's special branch guy. And we were with lots of the Americans, and it was a presidential thing. And the American Security Service were going on about it. Can't understand how you guys managed. Just a handful of you guys looking. We've got 500 guys out here, and we've got 1,000 on standby, and the security is so intense. Nobody would ever dare get near Reagan at the time. And I remember Trevor just sitting there and sitting back, and he said, "Oh well, we've never lost one." I thought it was a nice way of putting the American Secret Service in their place. Listen, I want to read out my question of the week.
Go on, question.
It takes us. We did a lot yesterday on the Tory leadership election, but the question of the week is from Andy Soars. Is there even one Tory leadership candidate who isn't an arsehole, wasn't a Johnson apologist, has some sense of what the economy actually needs, and doesn't have stupid ideas about the ECHR hunting or the metric system? Good question, Rory.
Let me turn that around to you. What's your answer?
I think they're all. I said yesterday, I think Sunak at least is trying to have from a different perspective to mine, but at least have a sort of serious debate about the economy. I do think the rest of them are just away with the fairies. They're just making promises they can't keep. And by the way, Sunak's doing that as well. And all the populist culture war stuff.
At this famous nightmare at Buxton where I lost my wedding ring, I asked, there were 950 people, I think, in the audience in the Opera House. And I did one of our naff straw polls that we keep doing at live affairs and asked them who they'd vote for. And it was very, very interesting. I would say well over half of them stuck their hands up for Tom Tugendhat. About 15%, I'd say, for Rishi Sunak. And then almost nobody for almost all the other candidates. Now, that may be that a literary festival in Buxton tends to attract a slightly more centrist lefty audience, but it was an interesting thing.
Presumably with Sunak as well, there's a lot of he's got name recognition in a way that some of the others haven't. Similar question. I was saying to you yesterday, Roy, I think this leadership contest is going to anger so many people. Somebody with the wonderful name Two Stone of Cellulite. We are now enthralled to 120,000 ageing Tory farts whose brain functions have been rotted by the right-wing press. How on earth do we resist all this? I think we should take a break on that one.
Here's one from Devonary, and it's an odd one to ask you. It's a sign of the direction the podcast may be going. My partner and I are huge fans for the podcast and got married last week. What advice would you give for a happy marriage?
Oh my God. I would say don't listen to The Rest is Politics on your honeymoon. I think that would be
that's
a very odd
I think that's an important one. And that's important.
I say here's the advice, Rory.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to follow.
Yeah.
But I think they should try to disagree agreeably.
That's good. That's good. That's good. I think
the other important thing I'd say is that
do you argue much actually at home? Or is Fiona the sort of exception to the rule? Are you not very argumentative at home?
No, we argue. Fiona is a great arguer, and she's very, very. She can be calm. She's incredibly kind, but she will always hold her own. No, we've had some fierce arguments, and of course the worst thing, I think this comes through in my diaries, the worst periods of my life in working in Number 10 were when I wasn't enjoying work and we weren't getting on at home because of something related to work. The Iraq War being the worst of all. But no, we have some pretty good arguments.
Very good. Okay. Excellent.
You didn't give. What about your advice? Don't lose your wedding ring.
Yeah, that's a really important bit of advice. I think I'm not sure. I mean, I think that'll have to wait for our next podcast called Rory and Alastair's Life Advice on a Happy Marriage.
Listen, there's one here as well. This extent to which everywhere we go at the moment, we're bumping into people literally who are listening to this podcast. One here from Kamlesh Bava wanted to apologise because one of my 3-year-old twins got in your way as you were trying to get through the barrier at King's Cross Tube yesterday, and then went on to say, "Do we need to stop constantly passing the baton to new Tory prime ministers without public involvement?" We've covered that one.
Was it me with the poor 3-year-old that I ran over my wheelie bag trying to get to Heathrow at King's Cross, or was it you at King's Cross?
This was when I was coming back from Newcastle after the rugby league. Here's a good one for you, Rory, as you're throwing difficult ones at me. Robert Slinger, Rory, how on earth did you fall for David Cameron's Big Society? It was a hollow slogan. It was all about getting the voluntary sector to step in for 40% local authority cuts.
Okay, let's do that one. So that's a proper serious one, and it's a bit more political than happy marriage. The answer is that it wasn't about just a cover up for the cuts. It was something that he sincerely wanted to do before the financial crisis. And actually, one of the ways in which the whole thing was destroyed, though, is that, of course, it was implemented at the same time as austerity. So that very, very quickly, people said this whole thing is just a way of trying to push responsibility onto the voluntary sector to deal with the cuts. But what I think it had much more going for it. I think it had a really important message, which is that local people, I felt this again in Cumbria. I felt it when we were building social housing. We did community-led social housing. We did community broadband projects. We did community renewable energy projects. And the point is that there are many areas of life where local communities know more, can do more, care more than distant officials. And we had some amazing successes of tapping the genius of communities because they were able to build far more low-income housing than the government would have been able to do in a way that was much more acceptable to communities, with nice designs in the right places, and tie it into getting the renewable energy going, getting the broadband in, saving local pubs. So I'm a real big society, unapologetic big society fan.
Okay, Robert, we'll look forward to you sending in your views in response. David Benton, you were both kicked out of your parties inappropriately. What conditions could you see that would make you rejoin?
Okay, well, I'll come to rejoining to you in a second, but I think the inappropriate kicking out is important because I think British politics got away with not having a proportional representation system because these parties were broad coalitions. They were tolerant of many, many different voices in them, and they worked like that. And I think the risk of throwing out people because they don't agree, in the case of Alastair, it was absolutely about Brexit. In my case, basically also about Brexit, but also because he was trying to get rid of the centre-left of the Conservative Party, is a very bad thing. And it's one of the reasons I think we need to change our electoral system. If these parties are not prepared to include differences of opinion, not prepared to be broad coalitions, things go wrong. Come back to it, though. What would make you rejoin the Labour Party?
I emotionally, I don't feel I left, really. I wasn't happy during the Corbyn period, that's true. But I do see with Keir Starmer, I can see a sense of direction and I can see a sense of purpose at the moment. I still think there's an awful lot they need to do better. I think I've quite enjoyed the freedom of people knowing that I'm still Labour, but I don't feel maybe as bound as I would have done. I know you think I'm not critical enough, but I actually probably am more critical than I've ever been. And I think that comes partly from freedom. So I don't know really. And Fiona's the same. Fiona, she actually left the Labour Party before I was kicked out, and that was over the anti-Semitism stuff. And she says she's that sense of freedom doesn't mean you don't stop. I desperately want Labour to win the next election, desperate, and I will, I will help them. But I joining the party, I'm not sure. And one of the other questions we got, by the way, was whether doing this podcast, here we are, James Marshall, what have you learned from each other? Has your politics changed since the podcast? I think I've definitely become, in talking to you every week, I've definitely become more persuaded of and we talked about this on the main podcast this week, that Johnson has been a symptom as well as a cause. of the broken politics, and it's the politics that has to be fixed.
Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end, but one final question.
Just a minute. Would you rejoin the Tory party?
Yes, with the right leader, who, if I thought the party was actually becoming what I'm desperate for, a liberal unionist party, a party of the centre-right, more of a teal-type party, I would definitely rejoin.
Well, that takes me to the question from Ruthless Cosmopolitan. Is the Conservative Party now so far to the right that a return of the death penalty is inevitable one day?
I pray not, but you are right that some of the dynamics that's emerging, some of the flattering, the harder right of the party, some of the populism does worry me a bit. Let me just maybe finish. I thought quite an interesting question, which may be a good one to finish on, which is about the police. Adam, as a serving police officer myself, I'd like to know what you think of the appointment of Mark Rowley as Met Commissioner, how Alastair's government got on with John Stevens, and how Rory would have approached the Met. Any reflections on how you got on with John Stevens, Metropolitan Police?
I think our relations with the police were reasonably good most of the time. It's interesting talking to the police. I don't know if I told you this, when I was doing this TV programme, Make Me Prime Minister, we were filming down not far from Johnson's constituency, actually. And we're in this park, and 2 police vans arrived, and a load of dogs got out. And the police, and I thought it was quite interesting. So, and then there was a policeman, police officer, man and woman, they jumped out of the vans, and the dogs were just kind of running around. So I went over to talk to them, we had a chat, and it turned out, so they work for the police dog section, and this is where they took them for a walk twice a day. And of course, you don't think about that. They've got 250 dogs. They have to take them for walks. So they're out walking the dogs. And so the dogs were walking around for about, I don't know, half an hour or so. So we ended up having quite a long chat, and it was really, really interesting. I mean, I feel very sorry for the police at the moment. And I felt a lot sorrier after this. The woman was telling me that it is a very rare week where she does not get spat at. It is very rare. And of course, now what's happening, they're getting abused in public. Friends of the people who are abusing them are filming it. They're trying to provoke them and so forth. And I do think that the extent to which, the government, I think, is both in relation to the health service workers and teachers and police officers, these constant attacks on public servants. And I think this whole sort of race to the bottom and, we're going to pay for all my unfunded tax and spending promises by getting rid of 20% of the civil service. They mean 20% of public service.
So just to maybe finish on the John Stevens point, I'm a huge admirer of John Stevens. He was I like him very much. I think he was an extraordinary police officer. He was somebody who led from the front, who was right there with the guys at 3 a.m. He's actually written a very good book, which we'll put on the podcast. People are interested in reading about policing. Maybe a bit old-fashioned from the point of view of some people, but I thought was a really positive force in the Metropolitan Police. And I think we do need a bit of that again. I think there has been a bit of a loss of confidence. I think Cressida Dick was a highly intelligent, I think, dedicated public servant, but a lot of things went wrong over the last few years.
I still think, by the way, even though, listen, lots of things went really wrong, badly wrong, but I do think that both Priti Patel as Home Secretary, successive mayors, they've found the police quite an easy political target. And I think that's making police very, very difficult. And one of the saddest things this police officer said to me, she said, I don't know a police officer at the moment who would recommend to their kids that they go into the police.
Oh, it's so sad. And you hear it, but I'd say the same about politics, the same about the Foreign Office, the same about teaching. It's very, very sad across the board. I think there's a lot of improvements that can come with the police. I think it's an amazing potential organisation, but I'm hopeful the new Met Commissioner is going to be able to get it back to the basics and restore some of that confidence. Thank you all. I think we all now have to run for our various aeroplanes from our airport hotels.
Well, then plant some trees.
And then go and plant some trees. Thank you all again for listening. From me, Rory Stewart, and
me, Alastair Campbell. And keep looking for Rory's ring. We have to find the Rory's ring. And I'll just go and cuddle my bike. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.